Welcome to Hub History, the show where we share our favorite stories from Boston history. This is episode 74, Original Sin, The Roots of Slavery in Boston. Hi, I'm Jake.
And I'm Nikki. This week, we're going to discuss the beginnings of slavery and the slave trade in Boston. After a ship arrived in the harbor in the summer of 1638 carrying a cargo of enslaved Africans, Massachusetts would continue to be a slave-owning colony for almost 150 years. We'll discuss the origins of African slavery in Massachusetts, and we'll compare the experience of enslaved Africans to other forms of unfree labor in Boston, such as enslaved Native Americans, Scottish prisoners of war, and indentured servants. A quick content warning before we begin. Our episode this week uses some of the racialized language of our 17th and 18th century sources, and an act of sexual violence is described and discussed. But before we talk about the roots of slavery in Boston, it's time to take a look at this week's featured historic site and upcoming event.
For our featured historic site this week, we're going to turn to Medford. Our story begins in 1732 when Medford, like Somerville, was still a part of the independent town of Charlestown. That year, Isaac Royal Sr. bought a large tract of land along the Mystic River in Charlestown and proceeded to spend the next 5 years renovating and expanding the modest brick farmhouse into what a traveler in the 1750s would describe as a fine country seat, being one of the grandest in North America. Along with the manor house, there were stables and carriage houses, barns and storage buildings for the farm, and a summer kitchen meant to keep the large fireplaces and ovens from making the main house uncomfortably hot during the warmer months. Royal was a wealthy Caribbean planter from the island of Antigua, having made his fortune in manufacturing rum and buying and selling slaves. When he moved to New England, he brought the trappings of his lifestyle in the Caribbean with him, including the enslaved Africans who would run his farm and household. When he first arrived, Royal brought 27 slaves with him from Antigua, making him one of the largest slaveholders in Massachusetts. The building that contained the summer kitchen is preserved, and it's often described as the last surviving slave quarters in the Northeast. Now, this description is a little bit misleading, as you'll learn if you take a tour of the house and slave quarters. The building that housed the summer kitchen was also used as a workshop for the many activities that the enslaved workers pursued to enable the royals to live in luxury, and it might have been used as a laundry. Yes, the enslaved people of the estate slept in the kitchen and workshops, but they would have also slept in the kitchen and workrooms in the manor house and possibly even in the barns. Slaves at the royal house, as with many families who owned slaves in New England, were expected to sleep in whatever space they labored in, simply rolling up their bedding and tucking it away when it was time to get to work in the morning. Isaac Royal Sr. died in 1739. Just a few years after moving his family into their new, slave-supported home. Isaac Jr. inherited the farm and at least 18 people who were enslaved there. Jr. was widely recognized as one of the most wealthy residents of Massachusetts, flaunting his riches by commissioning paintings, funding a new law school at Harvard, and riding around in a fancy coach attended by a team of enslaved coachmen in splendid matching uniforms.
The good times couldn't keep rolling on forever. Isaac Jr. held a number of positions within the Loyalist government in the years immediately before the Revolutionary War, including serving on the Governor's Council through 1774. While some historians believe he sympathized with the Patriots, he fled Medford among the rising tensions 3 days before war broke out at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. The family went first to Boston, then sailed to Halifax, before eventually settling in England. The family still owned about a dozen enslaved people at that time, and they were de facto freed when the royals left them behind. The Massachusetts legislature seized the house, and the Continental Army used it during the siege of Boston. Isaac was officially banished from Massachusetts for life as a Loyalist, but in 1806, the state of Massachusetts returned the house to his granddaughter and heir, who sold it. The house passed through the hands of a decreasingly wealthy series of owners throughout the 19th century, becoming more and more run down until it was finally purchased and opened as a museum in 1908. If you visit, you'll find recreations of the lavish furnishings of Isaac Jr.'s time, as well as original and reproduction portraits of the royal family by John Singleton Copley. In the slave quarters, you'll find a large collection of artifacts that were unearthed during excavations between 1999 and 2001. These archaeological finds are presented to spotlight the daily life and experiences of the men and women who were once enslaved there. Since the mid-2000s, the mission and interpretation of the Royal House has changed to focus on the lives of the enslaved rather than the enslavers. The result is a historical narrative unlike any I've experienced at any other historic sites that are tied to slavery. The Royal House and Slave Quarters will open for their 2018 season in May, with tours every weekend. It's located at 15 George Street in Medford with free on-street parking, or you can take the 96 bus from Harvard Square.
And for our upcoming event this week, we want to stick with the theme of slavery. For reasons that will become clear in a few minutes, this upcoming talk at the Massachusetts Historical Society is especially well suited to accompany this episode. This Wednesday, April 4th, Dr. Natalie Joy will give a lunchtime talk entitled Native Americans and the Anti-Slavery Movement. Joy is a professor of history at Northern Illinois University, and she has extensively studied and published on the links between Native American slave owners and radical abolitionists in the years leading up to the Civil War. From the MHS website, this presentation explores Native American participation in the American anti-slavery movement from the 1830s to the 1860s. In addition to attending meetings, Indians signed petitions, donated money, organized fundraising fairs, held positions in anti-slavery societies, and assisted fugitive slaves. Most significantly, they influenced abolitionist thought on a number of issues. The event begins at noon. It's free of charge, and registration is not required, but you are encouraged to bring a brown bag lunch to enjoy while Dr. Joy speaks. And as an extra bonus, keep in mind that this year's commemorations of Patriots' Day actually begin this coming weekend. On Saturday, April 7th, you can catch the Bedford pole capping, as well as both the Miriam's Corner exercise in Concord and the Paul Revere capture ceremony in Lincoln. From April 14th to the 21st, there are dozens of commemorations scheduled with activities nearly every day. We'll have a link to the full list from the National Park Service in this week's show notes. And with that, let's turn to this week's main topic.
Governor John Winthrop's diary records the arrival of the Desire in Boston Harbor on February 26, 1638. It was the first ship bearing enslaved Africans for sale in Massachusetts. Mr. Pierce, in the Salem ship the Desire, returned from the West Indies after 7 months. He had been at Providence and brought some cotton and tobacco and negroes, etc., from thence, and salt from Tortugas. Dry fish and strong liquors are the only commodities for those parts. Providence in this context refers to Providence Island Colony. It was a small island off the coast of Central America near what is today Nicaragua. It was settled by Puritan colonists in 1629 and 1630, many of whom had family and business ties to the colonists who were arriving on the Massachusetts Bay at about the same time. The English colonists were excited to take possession of an island they described as lying in the heart of the Indies and the mouth of the Spaniards. The Spanish Empire was extracting fabulous wealth from its colonies in the Americas, and these Puritans saw Providence Island as an excellent base from which to steal some of it. We've discussed the practice of privateering several times on the podcast, but in a nutshell, it's legalized piracy carried out with authorization by the government against ships belonging to an enemy nation. Soon after settling on Providence Island, privateers were setting sail from thence to prey on Spanish shipping. One of the prizes that a privateer would sometimes find on a vessel taken from the Spanish was a human cargo of Africans bound for slavery in the Spanish Caribbean. In the early years, these cargoes would be resold in other markets, but that would soon change. While the first settlers of Providence Island brought with them a few enslaved Africans, most of the initial labor was provided by English indentured servants. When the terms of bondage expired, the planters began to import enslaved Africans in large numbers by 1635. A few years later, the Desire found its way from there to Boston.
The arrival of the Desire in Boston may have marked the first large-scale importation of African people into Boston for sale, but it wasn't the absolute beginning of slavery in Boston. The first reference to an enslaved African in Massachusetts dates to 1633. William Wood's book, A New England Prospect, records that a group of Native Americans were walking in the forest when they were worse scared than hurt when seeing a blackamoor in the top of a tree looking out for his way which he had lost. Being near to the plantation, they posted to the English and entreated their aid to conjure this devil to his own place, who, finding him to be a poor wandering blackamoor, conducted him to his master. So while there was no slave trade in Massachusetts prior to 1638, there must have been at least a handful of enslaved Africans. African slavery in North America predates Boston, of course, with the Jamestown plantation in Virginia importing enslaved men in the year 1619. But slavery itself predates the arrival of English settlers in North America altogether. Many Native American tribes, including those in New England, practiced forms of slavery long before John Winthrop dreamed of a city upon a hill. Depending on the traditions of the tribe, captives taken in warfare might in some cases be ritualistically killed, but in many other cases they'd be enslaved to members of the conquering tribe. In some cases, these enslaved captives were used to perform tedious tasks like gathering firewood, hauling water, or weeding crops. In other cases, the course of enslavement was closer to adoption, with the captives being incorporated into the families to replace warriors killed in battle or women and children taken captive by other tribes.
Even white adventurers weren't immune to the practice of slavery by Native Americans. Thomas Morton was an Englishman who settled along the shore of Massachusetts Bay in what is now Quincy in 1624. His book, New English Canaan, was a harsh criticism of the Puritan government that sprang up in Boston a few years later. Though it is in part propaganda, Morton's book seems to faithfully recount many of the experiences of the Native American population around Massachusetts Bay between their first contact with Europeans and their decimation by European diseases and war a few years later. One of the stories he recounts is that of a French ship that was trading in Boston Harbor in what other sources refer to as the year 1616. It fortuned some few years before the English came to inhabit at New Plymouth, in New England, that upon some distaste given in the Massachusetts Bay by the Frenchmen, then trading there with natives for beaver, they set upon the men at such advantage that they killed many of them, burned their ship, then riding at anchor by an island there now called Pettick's Island in memory of Leonard Pettick that landed there, distributing them unto 5 sachems, which were lords of the several territories adjoining. They did keep them so long as they lived, only to sport themselves at them, and made these 5 Frenchmen fetch them wood and water, which is the general work that they require of a servant. The traditions of slavery practiced by Native Americans weren't the same as those we're familiar with in African American slavery in the antebellum South. Native Americans did not sell their enslaved captives to others. In many cases, there was a real possibility that an enslaved captive could assimilate into the tribe as a full member after some time. And, importantly, the children of enslaved captives were not considered hereditary slaves. That experience of Native American slavery would change after the arrival of English Puritans in Boston. After peaceful cohabitation for the first few years, the 1636 Pequot Wars were the first major conflict between the Massachusetts Bay colonists and their Native American neighbors. Battles raged from Block Island off the coast of Rhode Island to the Connecticut River Valley in western Massachusetts. By 1638, the English and their Narragansett and Mohegan allies had completely crushed the powerful Pequot tribe. As a result, several hundred captive women and children were distributed to the colonists to be enslaved as household servants for life.
The English believed that the Pequot warriors were too dangerous to enslave within the colony. Many were executed at the end of the war, and most of the survivors, along with some women and children, were shipped to Bermuda and the Caribbean to be sold as slaves. Some of these very captives were sent to Providence Island, where they were exchanged for the Africans who would be brought back to Boston on the Desire. By the 1640s, the English settlers of Boston were keeping both Africans and Native Americans as slaves, though there was no explicit legal sanction for the practice. In 1641, the colony adopted the Body of Liberties, the first written legal code passed by the Massachusetts General Court. Many of its stipulations are derived from biblical passages, and, at first glance, they seem to provide some protection against enslavement. The section dealing with capital crimes cites Exodus to state, "If any man stealeth a man or mankind, he shall surely be put to death." The section defining the liberties of foreigners and strangers also seems like it should prohibit the enslavement of humans. "There shall never be any bond slavery, villanage, or captivity amongst us, unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us. And these shall have all the liberties and Christian usages which the law of God, established in Israel, concerning such persons doth morally require. This exempts none from servitude who shall be judged thereto by authority." Unfortunately, the loopholes in that section are big enough to sail a slave ship through. The Native Americans who were now enslaved in Massachusetts, or sold out of the colony, were considered to be lawful captives taken in just wars. And the Africans who were imported in exchange for enslaved Pequots were considered strangers, meaning people who didn't practice Christianity, who were sold to us.
Soon, another class of unfree laborer would be entered into servitude on Boston's shores, having been judged thereto by authority. In the 1640s, John Winthrop Jr. set out to develop an iron industry in Massachusetts, so the colony would be able to produce its own metal goods and perhaps even export some. He first chose a site in Braintree, then later moved the factory to Saugus, where better water power was available. Along with a massive iron furnace and forges, there was a drop hammer and a slitting mill, all of which was powered by 7 water wheels. The ironworks required workers with specialized knowledge and skills, so the younger Winthrop made the unusual decision to import workers who didn't share the Puritan faith of the colony. Iron workers from England, Ireland, and Wales came to Saugus. Most of them were indentured for a period of 3 to 7 years, while a handful were free. They quickly earned a reputation as hard-drinking, hard-partying heretics who were almost never seen in church, but seemed to be in court almost constantly. As the indentures of these early workers came to an end around 1650, the faraway English Civil War presented another potential source of labor for the ironworks. The English Civil War was still raging between the parliamentarians, who were led by Oliver Cromwell, and the Scottish Covenanters, who supported Charles II's claim to the throne. In September of 1650, the English New Model Army fought a decisive battle against the Covenanters near Dunbar. Over 3,000 Scots were killed, and 10,000 were taken prisoner. After a death march from Dunbar to Durham, in which thousands died of starvation and exhaustion, some 1,400 Scots were sentenced to periods of servitude of 4 or 5 years.
In a 2004 article, Marcia Hamilton describes how hundreds of indentured Scottish men found their way to our shores. The English government did not know how to dispose of the Dunbar captives, and so welcomed the proposal of John Becks, a principal investor in the Company of Undertakers, to ship several hundred prisoners to Massachusetts. He planned to train some of the men to work in the ironworks to reduce both skilled and piecework labor costs. Becks expected to sell surplus laborers to farmers and mill operators in New England, thereby reaping a double dividend for the company. The first cohort of 150 Scottish prisoners arrived in Boston in December of 1650. The ironworks managers divided them up immediately, sending 35 to Saugus, keeping 17 at the company's Boston warehouse, and allocating a few to the Braintree furnace. The rest of the men were quickly sold throughout coastal Massachusetts. The plan worked so well that after the Battle of Worcester in 1651, Becks contracted with the English government to send another 250 captives to New England. While these Scottish workers would be listed as property of the ironworks during the term of their indenture, they were afforded privileges that weren't available to the African or Native American people who had been enslaved in Massachusetts. Most importantly, they were not enslaved for life. When their terms of servitude expired, they could choose to leave the colony. They had the right to marry, either while they were indentured or after. And they had the right to remain in the colony after their indenture, which many of those who married chose to do.
While the enslavement of Native Americans seems to have been an accidental byproduct of the Pequot War, the English colonists found it to be such a success that slavery would be seen as a motivation for future wars against their Native American neighbors. In 1645, the Massachusetts Bay Colony declared war on the Narragansett people, though a settlement was negotiated before bloodshed began. That year, Governor John Winthrop's brother-in-law wrote to him about the expected advantages of a new war against a Native American tribe. If upon a just war the Lord should deliver them into our hands, we might easily have men, women, and children enough to exchange for Moors, which will be more gainful pillage for us than we conceive. For I do not see how we can thrive until we get into a stock of slaves sufficient to do all our business. I suppose you know very well how we shall maintain 20 Moors cheaper than one English servant. The English settlers would have a renewed chance at gainful pillage when King Philip's War began in Massachusetts in 1675. After over 35 years of relative peace, this new conflict pitted the English settlers of New England against a loose confederation of Narragansett, Nipmuc, and Abenaki tribes, led by the Wampanoags and their charismatic leader, Metacom. From the beginning, both sides understood this war as an existential conflict. Either the English settlements would be uprooted, or the native peoples would be exterminated.
Jeremy Belknap, historian and founder of the Massachusetts Historical Society, wrote a paper about African slavery in Massachusetts in 1795. In it, he mentions the practice of making slaves out of Native Americans captured during King Philip's War. No other slaves were known here in these days excepting some of the aboriginals of the country who had, at various times, submitted themselves to the government. Of these, some did in 1675, 6, and 7 join with other natives in a war against the colonies commonly called King Philip's War. Such as were taken in arms were adjudged guilty of rebellion. A few of them were put to death by a judicial sentence, but the greater part were sold into slavery in foreign countries. In New England Bound, Wendy Warren points out that in this conflict, both hostile combatants and neutral Native Americans who had surrendered to the English were enslaved, saying that the Rhode Island Deputy Governor John Easton noted that 150 Indians came into a Plymouth garrison voluntarily, and that though these Indians had surrendered, the Plymouth authorities sold all for slaves but about 6 of them, to be carried out of the country. By the end of the war, the New England colonies held hundreds of Native American prisoners. Each colony quickly passed decrees allowing these captives to be, as the Plymouth document stated, condemned unto perpetual servitude, and sold for profit. A few were distributed around New England, but most were sold to the West Indian sugar plantations.
Bills of sale remain for dozens of men, women, and children, with prices falling as the war came to an end and the supply of enslaved captives outpaced demand. Young men and women in their teens and early 20s were considered the most promising workers, and thus assigned the highest prices. Children had the potential to be good workers, but would require care and feeding for years, so could be had at a steep discount. Old people were seen as nearly worthless, sometimes being traded for household goods. A record remains of one older man who was traded for 2 coats. Wendy Warren describes the fate of one old man who was unable to work when he surrendered to Plymouth Colony. One old man, though, was not sold. He was decrepit and could not go. He had been carried upon his son's back to the garrison, but when the son was sold away, he was left unprotected and immobile, useless to the English. The colonists debated how to dispose of the old man. Though some would have had him devoured by dogs, the tenderness of some of them prevailed, and instead of feeding him to their animals, they cut off his head. Decapitation is a strange sort of tenderness. Through all the brutality of this war, the main aim of all the slave trading on behalf of the English colonists seems to have been to get Native American captives out of the colonies and to bring enslaved Africans in. With the importation of Africans came an important shift in attitude toward the nature of servitude in Massachusetts. Until that point, there had been many kinds of unfree labor in the colony. Poor English or Irish citizens might volunteer to come to New England as indentured servants, bound to their masters for an agreed term of years. Puritan colonists who committed certain crimes or couldn't pay their debts might be involuntarily bound to servitude for a number of years until their penalty or debt was repaid. Native Americans who had been on the losing side of a war with the colonists might be bound to servitude for life. Scots who had been on the losing side of war were bound for a period of years.
However, there was one key difference between all these varieties of unfree labor and that of the enslaved Africans who began arriving in Boston in 1638. While the children of white indentured servants, enslaved Native Americans, or captive Scots were born free, the Puritan colonists of Boston soon determined that the children of enslaved Africans would be born as slaves. This was the introduction of the idea of hereditary, racialized, perpetual chattel slavery into New England, and its birth can be traced to a single moment. John Jocelyn was an early tourist on New England's shores. He was the son of a nobleman who had squandered the family fortune, leaving his sons to seek a new fortune. Henry Jocelyn came to New England in 1630 as part of an Anglican settlement, and he ended up on the Maine frontier embroiled in a territorial dispute between Puritan Massachusetts and his own fledgling colony. A few years later, his brother John decided to visit New England to see if he cared to make his fortune there. It would be the first of 2 extended visits to the New World. This time, he arrived in July of 1638 and ended up staying for about 15 months. In the summer and fall of 1638, John Jocelyn was staying as a guest in the home of Samuel Maverick. Maverick had been one of the earliest English settlers on the Massachusetts Bay, arriving in about 1624. He moved from present-day Weymouth to present-day Chelsea to a fortified house on Noddle's Island. Noddle's Island has since been connected to the mainland, and it makes up the bulk of East Boston. Maverick was an Anglican, and when the Puritans moved onto the Shawmut Peninsula right across the harbor, he found himself in frequent conflict with them. John Jocelyn may have picked up some of his brother Henry's antipathy for the Puritans, because he described Maverick as the only hospitable man in all the country, giving entertainment to all comers gratis.
Along with the farming and trading that was typical of early settlers on New England's shores, Samuel Maverick had a much darker, more sadistic plan to make his fortune in the New World, as John Jocelyn would experience. Maverick purchased 3 of the Africans who were imported into Boston in 1638 on the Desire, 1 man and 2 women. That fall, Jocelyn witnessed Samuel Maverick's plan to make these 3 enslaved people profitable. The 2nd of October, about 9 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Maverick's Negro woman came to my chamber window and in her own country language and tune sang very loud and shrill. Going out to her, she used a great deal of respect towards me and willingly would have expressed her grief in English, but I apprehended it by her countenance and deportment, whereupon I repaired to my host to learn of him the cause, and resolved to entreat him in her behalf, for that I understood before that she had been a queen in her own country, and observed a very humble and dutiful garb used towards her by another Negro who was her maid. Let's pause here for a moment to make sure we can make sense of the 17th century language. The woman who Samuel Maverick owned came to Jocelyn's bedroom window one morning and made a very loud, firm complaint in her own language, which must have seemed musical to the English ear. When Jocelyn went out of the house to see her, he sensed that she wished she could communicate her complaint in English. Being curious, he went to ask Maverick why she was angry and to plead on her behalf, as he had heard a rumor that she was the queen in her own country, and the other enslaved woman treated her with the deference due to a queen. Let's pick up the narrative again. Mr. Maverick was desirous to have a breed of Negroes, and therefore Seeing she would not yield by persuasions to company with a Negro man he had in his house, he commanded him, willed she nilled she, to go to bed with her. Which was no sooner done, but she kicked him out again. This she took in high disdain beyond her slavery, and this was the cause of her grief. Mr. Maverick was desirous to have a breed of Negroes. This was his plan, to make his 3 enslaved humans into breeding stock in order to produce enslaved children who could then be sold. The woman would not consent to sleep with the enslaved man Maverick owned, so he ordered the man to go to bed with her, willed she or nilled she, whether she wanted to or not. Maverick was ordering one enslaved person, who, himself, was not in a position to protest, to forcibly rape an unwilling woman in order to produce a child who could be sold as livestock. As Wendy Williams points out in the book New England Bound, John Josselyn seems to have given little more consideration to the forcible rape of an enslaved woman than he did to his first encounter with a wasp nest, which he moves on to in literally the next sentence. In taking the time to write down her story, Josselyn showed himself to be at least a momentarily sympathetic listener. But the very next paragraph of his narrative recounted, in humorous tones, his first encounter with a ferocious Native American wasp. It seems that little was done in response to the woman's complaints. Here, a woman had expressed her grief to an English observer. Here again, that sorrow proved no impediment to colonial determination.
In this one paragraph, before Josselyn's attention is diverted by a wasp's nest, this African woman passes briefly into the historical record before disappearing again. Nothing is known of what became of her after that moment, and little is known of where she came from before being enslaved. However, a 2011 article by Linda M. Haywood and John K. Thornton speculates that she could have been a member of the Congolese nobility, and possibly even a Christian. Though this nameless woman was probably not a queen as Josselyn imagined, she might have borne a title of some sort, for Central African nobles were occasionally enslaved. The Kingdom of Congo was the principal source of both nobles and Christians during this period. Congo had been officially Christian since 1491, and the faith had grown in the 17th century. Congo was racked by civil wars in this period. These wars involved large armies, and it's likely that many people were enslaved under them and subsequently sold to Luanda. Congo armies included thousands of soldiers who were classified as nobles. Their wives often accompanied them to battle to provide for domestic services, and so might have been captured. Undoubtedly, some of the ships departing Luanda that were later intercepted by English and Dutch privateers also carried many Congolese Christians, including nobles, in their holds. The appearance of this nameless African woman outside Josselyn's window is representative of a shift in unfree labor in New England. While the children of other groups, Native American slaves, indentured servants, and war captives bound for life, were born free, a 1670 law stipulated that the children of African slaves would be born slaves.
Unfortunately, this distinction is lost on a wide swath of the American populace today. The idea that Irish people were widely held in slavery in North America is common today, to the point where many accounts of the trial of Goody Glover, an indentured Irish servant who was executed for witchcraft in Boston in 1688, refer to her as an Irish slave. This idea of Irish slavery is exploited by white supremacists, with the simplest form being a meme saying, "The Irish were slaves too, and you don't hear us complaining about how the world owes us a living." But in reality, the comparison is just not accurate. Liam Hogan, a librarian in Limerick, Ireland, who has extensively researched and debunked the myth of Irish slavery, describes it like this. The intent is thus patently clear, to insidiously equate indentured servitude or penal servitude with racialized, perpetual, hereditary chattel slavery. This is an obscene rhetorical move which decontextualizes and dehistoricizes the exploitation of both groups. There have been many different forms of slavery across space and time. That is not the issue here. we are addressing the mainstream endorsement of a growing white nationalist campaign built on a reductionist fallacy which is inevitably used to justify racism in the present. For example, the spurious "we went through the same thing, but we don't complain" sentiment, which is now frequently deployed to silence debate and to mock demands for justice and truth-telling. While Massachusetts and Boston have a lot to be proud of in the 19th century abolition movement, it's important also to tell the truth about the history of slavery in this Commonwealth. The description of hereditary chattel enslavement originating in Boston from Samuel Maverick's so-called breed of Negroes forces us to confront the reality of slavery in Boston. I think many people assume, as we did, that slavery in Massachusetts in some way wasn't as bad as slavery elsewhere.
Certainly it's true that there weren't large plantations worked by enslaved laborers in New England in the same way there were in the South. Because Massachusetts didn't have plantations, most slave owners in the Commonwealth owned 1 or 2 people at most, who lived in close quarters with the family. This leads to a logical leap that I've seen expressed many times as, essentially, if they were living together, how bad could it be? No matter how humane it was supposed to be, slavery was still slavery. After abolition, former slaves described the fear of family separation as one of the worst aspects of enslavement. This fear was very real for the enslaved in Massachusetts, as Jeremy Belknap recorded. Negro children were reckoned an encumbrance in a family and, when weaned, were given away like puppies. They have been publicly advertised in the newspapers to be given away. Indeed, there are many examples of that type of advertisement, like this one from the Boston Gazette in 1769. To be given away, equipped at all points, a very likely Negro child of an excellent breed. Inquire of Eads and Gill.
Remember that Belknap was writing over 150 years after the heyday of Samuel Maverick when he says that enslaved children were considered so worthless that they were given away. Of course, Maverick had speculated that children would be a very valuable commodity for him. If you'd like to find out more about why children were later considered worthless, the book The Price for Their Pound of Flesh by Dana Ramey Berry examines the changing valuation of enslaved persons' bodies over the course of their lives. If there was any question that slavery in Massachusetts was dehumanizing, Belknap dispels it, recounting, "They were inventoried and taxed as rateable property." Researchers today use probate records to reveal the lives of enslaved people, where they are listed alongside cattle, horses, furniture, and other personal property.
Even if an enslaved person could somehow earn enough money to buy their own freedom, or if a slave owner decided to free their human property, there were legal barriers. Such of them as were prudent and industrious purchased their freedom. Some were liberated by their masters, but there was a law against their manumission, unless their masters gave bonds that their estates and heirs should maintain them in case of sickness or decrepitude, so that they might not become a burden to the public. The day-to-day activities of an enslaved person were restricted by curfews, laws prohibiting them to assemble, laws specifying what types of work they could do, and even laws preventing them from marrying freely. Enforcement of these laws was carried out through fear. A house of correction, to which disorderly persons of all colors were sent, formed one object of terror to them. But to be sold to the West Indies, or to Carolina, was the highest punishment that could be threatened or inflicted. While slaves in the antebellum South feared being sold down the river, slaves in Massachusetts feared being sold to the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. There, the average life expectancy of an enslaved person was less than 7 years.
Jeremy Belknap was writing this account of slavery in Massachusetts in 1795, just about a decade after slavery was abolished in Massachusetts. He was writing in response to an inquiry from a Virginia judge who was incredulous that our Commonwealth had lived through a peaceful end to this peculiar institution. Unlike in the American South, slavery in Massachusetts didn't end overnight with a great civil war or proclamation of emancipation. Instead, There was a long series of legal cases brought by enslaved people in Massachusetts against their owners, arguing that slavery was incompatible with the concepts of liberty embodied in the state constitution written by John Adams. Manumission was gradual, but the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court recognized by 1783, 145 years after the Desire arrived in Boston Harbor, that there can be no such thing as perpetual servitude of a rational creature. But I think the freedom suits that brought slavery in Massachusetts to a legal end are another topic for another, perhaps happier, podcast.
To learn more about the roots of slavery in Boston, check out this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/074. We'll have a link to John Joslin's account of Samuel Maverick's breeding program, Jeremy Belknap's notes on the history of slavery in Massachusetts, and Thomas Morton's account of Native American customs on Massachusetts Bay prior to the arrival of the Puritans, as well as a number of other primary sources. We'll also point you to 4 books that might be helpful if you want to read more about this topic. And of course, we'll have links to information about this week's featured historic site and upcoming event.
If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at podcast@hubhistory.com. We're Hub History on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Or you can go to hubhistory.com and click on the Contact Us link. While you're on the site, hit the subscribe link and be sure that you never miss an episode. If you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, please think about writing us a brief review, as it is still the best way to help others discover the show.
That's all for now. We'll be back next week.